My name is Jacqueline Burgetts, and I am the Associate Director for Emerging Initiatives in the Office of Strategic Partnerships and Technology Innovation at the Center for Devices and Radiological Health at the Food and Drug Administration. I am delighted to welcome you to this public workshop titled Using Patient-Generated Health Data in Medical Device Developments, Case Examples of Implementation Throughout the Total Product Lifecycle. So next slide. Today's session is recorded, and the recording will be sent to everyone who registered for the workshop as soon as it is available. We will also post the recording on the website for this public workshop. If you have questions during the workshop, please submit them to the panelists and hosts in the Q&A box. We will do our best to include your questions in the panel discussions as time allows. Next slide. So the purpose of this two-day workshop is to illustrate how patient-generated health data can promote medical device innovation. You will hear from patients, industry sponsors, regulators, and researchers as they share their perspectives on how patient-generated health data can advance remote clinical trial data collection and support clinical outcome assessment. Ultimately, our goal is to advance patient science, patient engagement, and health equity for medical devices. With patient-centered data, we seek to advance device developments and regulatory decision-making. As the title of this public workshop suggests, we will provide concrete case examples to illustrate how patient-generated health data has been implemented in the current state of medical device developments. Over the next 2 days, we will discuss the many ways that patient-generated health data could be implemented as an avenue through which we center the diverse body of patients in research, device developments, and regulatory decision-making. Next slide. This public workshop is co-sponsored by the Digital Medicine Society and the Food and Drug Administration's Center for Devices and Radiological Health. This public workshop is a continuation of our efforts at the FDA and the Center for Devices and Radiological Health related to patient-generated health data. In 2016, we released our draft guidance on real-world data. In 2018, we held a patient engagement advisory committee meeting to hear from patients on the role of patient-generated health data in post-market surveillance. In 2021, we held a public workshop on patient-generated health data, which underscored our continued commitments to patient science in medical device development. Since then, we have all experienced a global pandemic, which illustrated the value of remote clinical trial data collection. And in 2022, we here at the Center for Devices and Radiological Health instituted a strategic priority to advance health equity. Our goal is to meet the unmet and unaddressed health conditions in diverse populations. All of these factors over time have underscored our commitment to patient-generated health data and made it clear that device manufacturers, regulators, patients, and researchers all have a part to play as we move forward in a manner that benefits us all. Next slide. After this introduction, my colleague from the Food and Drug Administration and co-lead for this public workshop, Robert Wright, will discuss the fundamentals of patient-generated health data, so we're all speaking the same language. Next, we will have Elena Ismailova, a patient who is also a clinical scientist. Elena will give the keynote address about her lived experience using her own patient-generated health data to navigate cancer treatment. This will lead to our keynote panel discussion on advancing clinical research with patient-generated health data. As you can see here in the agenda overview, we have 3 sessions with case examples and then concluding remarks. Thank you for joining us. Now I'll pass it over to my co-lead for the public workshop at the Digital Medicine Society, Smit Patel.
Thank you, Jackie, for the excellent welcome. Good morning, everybody. My name is Dr. Smit Patel, and I'm the Associate Program Director here at DIME, or Digital Medicine Society, overseeing programs for digital health technologies and AI from evidence, regulatory, and implementation science. And for those of you who may not know about DIME, we are a global nonprofit with a mission to advance safe, effective, equitable use of digital technologies as we think about redefining healthcare and improving lives. And on behalf of my team at DIME, I'm delighted to welcome you all and also co-chairing this public workshop with our colleagues at FDA. So let's take a moment to remind us, why are we here? Why are we talking about PGHD and the use in medical device development? As we gather here today, let us take a moment to consider that how deeply woven digital health technologies are into our daily lives. From the moment we wake up to the time we close our eyes, these technologies are with us. And what's important is the opportunity that silently and continuously these technologies and tools gather the data that were beyond our reach. And what's historic about this is the first time in the last 50 years that we can objectively measure health in real time. And we are no longer the passive observers of the health, but rather an active participants in shaping it. And as we think about new streams of data, multimodal data generated through these tools, this is our new gold mine. The high quality, rich data sets is the new currency in today's healthcare economy, and the currency that's minted through lived experiences of the patients, their priorities, their preferences, their needs, and the interaction. And these each individual pieces collected by patients are making clinical research not just what it's called inform, but infinitely more impactful. So I want everyone to close your eyes and imagine us in 2030, a couple of years from now, a time where clinical trials are no longer limited to geographical boundaries, participants' race, ethnicity, language, socioeconomic barriers, a time where clinical trials are not just for privileged or white male population, but for everybody, a time where patient voices are not just checkbox on a checklist, but we prioritize capturing real-world outcomes that matters to the patients, leading to developments of devices and new therapies that fundamentally aligns with the preferences of the patients. And I think this is possible. This is possible through the digitally enabled clinical research and the future that we are stepping into. What a beautiful future, isn't it? Well, it's a beautiful future, but we have a lot of work to do. How do we think about building the processing and accelerating medical device timelines? How do we think about integration parameters of PGHD as our field moves into more connected and integrated healthcare ecosystem? As we think about scale and infrastructure, how do we build that resilient, robust, and outcome-driven trials? What role does our government colleagues and regulatory colleagues play as we think about building out the PGHD capabilities? And let's be real, it's high time we stop admiring the challenges of D&I and clinical trials and start building processes, infrastructure, and policies to curb the future health equity gaps that will exist so that hopefully someday my South Asian parents or my friends from Black, Latino, transgender, immigrant communities can also participate in clinical research. We have to think about the data stewardship. We have to think about the data transparency, looking into how do we truly build trust in the patients as we think about advancing PGHD. These are not just easy questions to address. And we are not here to beat around the bush and do the easy things. As one of my mentor, Jennifer Goldsack, CEO of Dime, says, we have to be as brave as patients and participants who need us. And the only future we will build is the one that we can imagine today and put our actions to tomorrow. So on behalf of FDA and Dime, as we build this roadmap of PGHD and the use of it in medical device development across total product life cycles, we're really, really excited for your participation. And over the next 2 days, you will see programming that will showcase real world examples, individuals and experts and organizations who will show you, not just tell you, with 10 plus case examples on how they are integrating PGHD. You'll hear from policymakers, including the White House, FDA, and ARPA, each talking about how do we think about policy advancements and infrastructure building. You will, both the days of programming very shortly will start from patient voices and real stories as a part of the programming, but also each and individual sessions. And we'll have over 15 leaders from government colleagues standing shoulder to shoulder with patients, academic scientists, regulators, industry leaders, actively participating in this dialogue. And this is how we make change. This is how we progress the field. And on behalf of Dime and FDA, we are delighted you are with us on this journey. So let's get to it. Next, I would love to welcome my colleague, Robert Wright, to share about what is PGHD and how do we talk about PGHD in the context of medical device development.
Thank you, Smith. Thank you, Jackie. Welcome and thank you for joining today's public workshop on patient-generated health data. My name is Robert Wright, and I'm a social scientist in the Division of Patient-Centered Development in the Center for Devices and Radiological Health at the FDA. Over the next 2 days, we will hear many stakeholders discuss the use of patient-generated health data in the medical device total product lifecycle. Before we begin, we will define and describe 3 concepts that will be discussed throughout the public workshop. 1, patient-generated health data. 2, remote clinical trial data collection. And 3, clinical outcome assessments. First, what are patient-generated health data? Patient-generated health data, or PGHD, are health-related data that are created, recorded, or gathered by or from patients or caregivers outside of the clinical setting. These data can be actively provided or passively collected. It can include biometric data, symptoms, lifestyle choices, and health and treatment histories. For example, PGHD can include capturing activity levels using a mobile application, recording symptoms using a wearable device, collecting biometric data such as blood pressure using a medical device, or collecting reports of quality of life using electronic questionnaires. Again, PGHD are health-related data that are created, recorded, or gathered by or from patients or caregivers outside of the clinical setting. Within this definition of patient-generated health data, we will highlight three topics: centering patients, health equity, and reducing the patient burden. Dr. Jeff Shuren, the director of the Center for Devices and Radiological Health, provided an excellent summary of the importance of the patient voice in his introductory remarks during the 2021 PGHD meeting. Simply put, patients are at the heart of what we do at CDRH. To show how all patients are at the heart of our work, one of our strategic priorities at CDRH is advancing health equity. In our strategic plan, it states that CDRH is committed to addressing the disparities by working towards assuring that all patients have access to safe, effective, and high-quality medical devices. This commitment includes ensuring that devices are designed to be safe and effective, that evaluation of devices take into account the diverse populations for which they are intended, and that patients and consumers have the information they need to make decisions about their healthcare. When done well, PGHD can advance health equity through inclusion of diverse patient perspectives and integration of data from diverse patients. Finally, PGHD has the potential to reduce patient burden, which has implications for the recruitment and retention in clinical trials to support medical device development. PGHD can reduce patient burden by lowering barriers to participation because it meets patients where they are at versus centering a research site as a point of data collection. This brings us to our second concept, remote clinical trial data collection. Over the next 2 days, we will explore how patient-generated health data can advance remote clinical trial data collection, which involves collecting data from patients at locations other than traditional clinical sites. A clinical trial can be completely remote, where all activities take place at locations other than the traditional site, such as at home or in a local healthcare facility. A clinical trial can also use a hybrid approach where patients go to the traditional trial site for in-person visits, but also collect data remotely, such as at home. The FDA recently published the final guidance titled Digital Health Technologies for Remote Data Acquisition and Clinical Investigations. This guidance represents the FDA's current thinking on the use of digital health technologies, which include PGHD and remote data capture. Finally, we will also explore how patient-generated health data can support clinical outcome assessments, which is a third concept I would like to describe in the session on fundamentals of PGHD. A clinical outcome assessment, often called a COA or COA, describes or reflects how a person feels, functions, or survives. These assessments can be reported by the patient, a healthcare provider, a non-clinical observer such as a parent or caregiver, or through performance of an activity or task. When done electronically or digitally, they are often referred to as e-COAs or e-COAs. For regulatory purposes, high-quality information from COAs can provide valuable evidence for evaluation. In this workshop, the case examples and discussions will highlight technologies used to capture meaningful outcomes in important remote assessments. Now that we are all on the same page on these three concepts for the workshop, patient-generated health data, remote clinical trial data collection, and clinical outcome assessments, let's go into more detail how we operationalize them at the Center for Devices and Radiological Health. We here at CDRH interface with patient-generated health data in 4 general ways. First, a device can directly capture patient-generated health data as a regulated medical device that is evaluated at the center. For example, a continuous glucose monitor device. Second, a technology that is not classified as a medical device can capture PGHD to support the regulatory evaluation of a different regulated medical device. For example, an off-the-shelf consumer activity tracker bracelet with sensors and software to measure step count used as part of a study to evaluate a new medical device. Third, the Medical Device Development Tools Program, or MDDT program, This voluntary program qualifies tools such as those that capture patient-generated health data for use in assessing the safety, effectiveness, or performance of medical devices. Once a tool is qualified, it can then be relied upon by CDRH reviewers without the need to reconfirm the suitability and utility of the MDDT when used within the qualified context of use in a regulatory submission. The intent of this program is to promote the development and use of tools to streamline device development and regulatory evaluation. For example, the MDDT program qualified the first digital health technology this past May, the Apple atrial fibrillation history feature. The tool was designed as a biomarker test to help evaluate estimates of AFib burden as an endpoint within clinical studies to evaluate the safety and effectiveness of cardiac ablation devices to treat AFib. Our fourth and final bucket is the use of patient-generated health data to improve regulatory science through research. CDRH is active in internal and external research studies to better understand how and when high-quality patient-generated health data can impact regulatory science and regulatory decision-making. For example, there's currently an open regulatory science challenge titled Digitally Derived Endpoints for Freezing of Gait Detection. In the challenge, the FDA is calling on the public to develop models to identify and predict freezing of gait in individuals living with Parkinson's disease. The goal of this challenge is to support the development and validation of digitally derived endpoints to be used in clinical trials and a person's day-to-day life. You can find more information about the challenge, including information on how to participate, by going to precision.fda.gov. Today, we discussed 4 general ways in which we interface with PGHD at CDRH: medical devices directly capturing PGHD, PGHD to support a medical device review, the MDDT program to qualify PGHD tools, and PGHD to improve regulatory science research. We also defined 3 concepts that will be the subject of our 2-day public workshop: patient-generated health data, remote clinical trial data collection, and clinical outcome assessments. With these fundamentals, let's continue the conversation with us all speaking a shared language. Thank you once again for joining us. It is now my pleasure to introduce today's keynote speaker, Elena Ismailova, the Chief Scientific Officer at Conexa Health. She will be presenting her talk titled Receiving Cancer Treatment, Decoding My Own Data and Advancing Clinical Research, My Dual Life as a Patient and Clinical Scientist. Thank you, Elena.
Thank you, Robert, for a wonderful introduction. And I would like to start my presentation with thanking the workshop organizers for inviting me today and allowing me to share my story. I sincerely hope that sharing my story will help other patients who move through a similar journeys and also a scientific community. A few words of my background, because it will be important for the story I'm about to share. I am a scientist. I have PhD in biology, and at this time, I'm Chief Scientific Officer at Conexa Health, the company that provides scientific services for developing digital endpoint, provides also an IT platform for digital data integration and data analysis. Prior to this appointment, I spent 15 years in the pharma R&D, and I started my career by developing biomarker assays for clinical trials before going full-time digital. The next slide. We've heard a wonderful introduction from Robert about patient-generated health data. I don't have to explain what it is. Here you see the table about opportunities and benefits of collecting PGHD data for cancer patients. This table is from my review article that I published with Dr. William Wood in summer of 2021. When the paper became available online, I was not celebrating. I was getting ready to head to the hospital because I received a diagnosis of suspected cancer. The diagnosis came completely out of the blue. It was a routine screening. It was my first colonoscopy. And I didn't anticipate it at all. I didn't have symptoms. I had no family history, and I had a lifestyle that would not suggest anything close to cancer. It was a difficult time. It was a dark time, and I did some soul searching. And during this time, I told myself, you know what? You have written a paper how great would be to collect PGHD for cancer patients. Now it's your chance to test it for real. The next slide, please. And I did so. Before heading to the hospital, I assembled my own kit of digital devices. They included medical devices, a pulse oximeter, a blood pressure monitor that collected point and time measures, and I also used a patch to collect body temperature that was a continuous data recording. And I used 2 fitness trackers, one on the wrist and one on the fingers, because I knew it would be important to monitor my physical activity. I knew that I had to baseline myself, and I had enough time to get a robust baseline because it was a single patient study. There will be no control arm here. I left my devices at home before heading to the hospital for cancer removal surgery. Part of my colon would have to be removed, and I left my technologies at home because hospitals strongly urged not to bring them, and I started using them as soon as I got home. Just in case, if you are worried about me, I can tell you this is a medical happy end story. Everything went well. The tumor was removed. I had to stay in the hospital for 5 days because I had some post-surgical complications, but I recovered well. I returned to work, and the pathology result of my tumor material showed an early stage tumor, and I didn't need any additional treatments, and my prognosis is good. Now it's time to share what I learned doing this self-generated study of myself as a patient, not so much as a scientist. It's really difficult to sleep in the hospital. Vital sign checks are going round the clock. It is a necessity because frequent checking vital signs can show early adverse events, helping them to curtail them. Practically, for a patient, it means that a patient cannot sleep more than 2 hours in a row in a semi-private room, and that also includes nighttime. By the time I got home, I was exhausted from sleep deprivation. And I started using my set of devices. It was easy, it was convenient, and essentially I was mirroring what the hospital was doing. It was heavenly. I could sleep through the night. I also used my commercial trackers. Physical activity is an interesting story here. When I got home, my first day step count was slightly over 300 steps. When I was in the hospital, the medical personnel knew that it would be important for patients to move, and they strongly encouraged me to walk several times in the hospital corridor using an IV stand as a walking aid, recording in the whiteboard in my room how many times I walked and how far. When I got home, I was on my own, and 300 steps was not good. From my own research done in collaboration with Montefiore Medical Center in Bronx, I knew that if I stay under 1,000 steps per day, I likely to be readmitted. It was not surprising because I don't have a big house. I don't have a long corridor like the hospital does, and there are a bunch of obstacles, doors, windows, furniture, stairs. But once I knew that I need to improve my physical activity, I got help from my family members who were my caregivers. And the next day, my step count was already over 2,000 steps, which was a huge improvement. Once I recovered, I got back to work. The next slide. And I shared story with my colleagues at Connexa, and we started looking at my data. The next slide shows my graph of my own data from one of the fitness trackers. I stopped collecting the vital sign data 1 week after getting home because at that point, the risk of adverse events was much lower. But here we see my data on daily step count, pulse, and heart rate variability. As you can see, there's a lot of day-to-day variation, but the direction of change is unmistakable. By the time I was ready to go back to work, I returned to the baseline. And what was very important here that I kept my own diary, collecting some events that I thought would be important to bring to the doctor's attention when I had follow-up visits after the discharge from the hospital. If you are a scientist, you may look at the graph and say, okay, this is a pretty graph, so what? 2 takeaways here. Number 1, if you imagine that it was not a daily summary of data collection, but limited time points, as one would do during the follow-up visits, the direction of change would be largely depend on when the data was collected, and probably the direction of change would be a lot less clear. The second outcome, which is on the next slide, is that I shared my data with Connexa data scientists, and we put our heads together to see if we can get more insights from my data. And indeed, we did. Using 2 variables, heart rate variability and daily step counts, we developed a model that correctly identified 80% of the days when I was unwell, according to my diary, when both parameters dropped below the 25th percentile. It made a difference which 25th percentile we used, my own baseline data or normative data sets that we checked out as well for gender and age matched populations. So probably both have a utility in the future research. The next slide, please. Fully recognizing that this is a single patient study, a simplest way of probably BYOD study when it comes to sensor-based data, I would like to share some of the insights that will hopefully guide using these insights in the population-based studies. First of all, I could use only over-the-counter technologies because of the settings, but in clinical trials, it would be possible to use also prescription devices that can enrich data collection. I did the data integration manually on paper because that's what was available to you. However, automated data integration through a data integration platform will be required for any clinical studies. These platforms are available through some of the hospitals, and they are also commercially available. And I was able to interpret the data because of what I know because of my profession. However, the majority of patients cannot access this kind of level of data care. and generalizability to the results that would enable doctors to interpret them. There are multiple ways to do it. Is, as I mentioned, collecting baseline data, comparing to normative data sets. But very important, we need to create PGHD data sets that can serve as normative reference points and get to the point that we can use PGHD data similar to what we do now with blood test results, when both patients and doctors can see where patient fits in the normal range and which test is within the norm and which one is abnormal. I also mentioned that I kept my own diary. It was an unstructured diary. I just took notes of what I thought would be useful in the future in my conversation with the doctors. And recently, we discussed this topic with a ECOA consortium at the Critical Path Institute and concluded that probably unstructured patient diary with unsolicited, unstructured input can be useful in concept elicitation studies and can be augmented by emerging machine learning technologies. The next slide, please. Today, I gave you a flavor of two domains of potential PGHD data that make sense to collect for cancer patients: physical activity and vital signs. There are additional data types that can be collected, including sleep data that have been demonstrated to be declining. Sleep quality was shown to be declining during anti-cancer therapy, and also patient-related quality of life or symptoms that are known only to patient. I would like to conclude my presentation by summarizing of what was my experience going through the journey and answering the question, was it worth my time and effort to collect PGHD data? The answer is absolutely. In addition to the data that was useful in conversation with my doctors, who were very receptive of discussing this data and listened to me, I can tell that I felt empowered by my own PGHD. I felt a part of the team. I felt I am contributing, not just a passive recipient of medical services. And I hope today's discussions will help extending this empowerment and sense of community to other patients who can do as I did, generate their own PGHD data and contribute to both devices and medicinal product development. Thank you very much for your time and attention, and I will pass right now the baton to Robert, who will introduce our next discussion panel.
Thank you so much, Elena. That was incredible to hear and very much appreciate you sharing that. So we will now transition to our panel of the keynote, Vision 2030, Advancing Clinical Research with Patient-Generated Health Data. Joining Elena will be Jeremy Wyatt, the CEO at Actigraph, Christian Sneeman, Senior Director at Fast Cures at the Milken Institute, Annie Saha, Associate Director for Strategic Initiatives in the Digital Center of Excellence here at CDRH at the FDA. Elena, please take it away.
Thank you. So I will start again with my own example and say I just shared my story. You know that a single patient can collect a PGHD as long as this patient has access to resources and specific technical knowledge, but I would like to fast forward to 2030 that Smith talked earlier and talk about our vision for next year, few years ahead of us. Can you tell me, please, what is your vision for 2030 from where you are now, and how can we accelerate device development using PGHD, and where we would like to be by the end of this decade? Who would like to go first?
And Ellen, I'm happy to chime in there, but
Thank you,
first,
Jeremy.
First, let me just say, bravo for sharing your story a moment ago. It's so inspiring, and thank you for sharing your journey with us. We had a lot to learn from that, and the team at Connexa did a great job there. Thank you for asking the question about 2030. There's so much opportunity and so much to unpack there. It's just phenomenal. I think we're in a phase right now of technology adoption and clinical research where we're trying to get across this chasm of, sort of early adopters into the mainstream, early majority. And really, I see that happening in the next 2 to 3 years. And by 2030, I suspect we'll go from collecting data and trying to learn from it like we're doing today to a place where we're really shifting it to risk prevention and risk avoidance. I also think that we'll begin to see the application of some of this data in placebos, so we can get away from the placebos and begin to see really some more synthetic trials being run and more opportunities just to be better for the patient. And really, this is all about the patient. And so, I really see that shift happening. Yes, it takes time, but this is a purposefully risk-averse industry. We want to do things step by step and in a methodical fashion. But I do see this shifting towards the patient. I do see things getting better for the patient, and there's a lot to unpack. I'll ask the other panelists their thoughts too. But really, it's a shift in power, in my opinion, towards the patients.
Thank you, Jerry. It's very reassuring to hear, because I definitely would like to see more patients to have the same access to the resources like I did. Kristen, what is your vision for 2030?
Yeah, no, that was a wonderful segue to some points that I wanted to make as well. And thank you also from me, Elena, for your extremely informative story. It's really quite a wonderful journey you went on that you're trying to use to elevate the whole field. But I think this notion that patient-generated health data can help drive us towards a more patient-centered research process and system is one that I also believe in. I think that's a vision that is achievable by 2030, but I think we have to be intentional about it. I think just because at the risk of stating the obvious, patient-generated or patient-reported data isn't necessarily patient-centered, patient-engaged, patient-informed, but it should be, and we have to be intentional about that. And I think I picked up on the word that you used, Elena, of feeling that you were an active part of the process and of your healthcare, and that you felt empowered. But that is not necessarily going to be the case just because data is coming from what we might consider a patient-generated source. It's kind of struck me that sort of historically patient-generated has connoted lesser quality or reliability, I feel like, but that doesn't have to be the case if the tools that are used to collect it are high quality and reliable, right? So data reported to clinicians in a doctor's office aren't always high quality or reliable either. And we're kind of at the point where the locus of data collection shouldn't and doesn't need to define its utility. We have the technology, we have the appetite to integrate this kind of data, and we have to do it. It's the third leg of the stool, along with clinical and claims data, to really give us that holistic picture of people's health that we need. So I think my vision is sort of has three pieces to it. One of them is, I think, maybe obvious to everyone at this point. Every trial and study should be using decentralized elements and remote tools for data collection and participation, and they're not always technology tools, so that more people in more communities and more places can participate. I think the second one is that patient experience data is collected and taken into account in every research study, every regulatory evaluation, and hopefully every coverage decision. And then finally, and this alludes to your story as well, Elena, that participants have access to the data that they're contributing in a way that's informative and actionable to them. So even in the context of a study where they may not have visibility into the inner workings of the data in the study itself, to the extent that they have access to some data that will help them understand their health status and hopefully improve it. You talked about improving the number of steps you were taking because you had access to that data, right? And you knew that that was important. That we're thinking about ways in which we can make sure that people are getting this. The data's theirs. You know, all this health data, regardless of where it's coming from, is our data, is patients' data, is people's data. So to the extent we can think about ways to give people access to that in a way that's actionable and informative to them, I think that's important to think about as well.
Thank you, Kristen. These are great insights. And of course, we would like, as always, we would like to hear from the FDA. Annie, this is your turn.
Great. Well, I think my vision, so by 2030, it's not an N of one of Elena who has who's the activated patient who knows the technology, but that really this is seamless and that anyone has access to their patient-generated health data and that's actionable in some way that's meaningful to them. And that's really a seamless proposition and not you have to do a lot of your own legwork in order to be able to use the data and ultimately, hopefully, to not become a patient. But ultimately, if we can get towards wellness, prevention, you know, early diagnosis, and leveraging patient-generated health data that's patient-centric, that's meaningful to both patients, clinicians, in a way that we can help support people in their day-to-day lives, and that we start talking about this data as, you know, just endpoints. It's not digitally derived. Digital isn't the scary, you know, thing that we're not sure what to do, that we've kind of crossed, as Jeremy, you know, pointed out, we've kind of crossed that chasm by that point of being able to just, we know how to use the data, we know how to develop, you know, we know how to do endpoint development. There's a little bit extra with digital, but let's, you know, start with what we know and really build from there. And that really we're able to do this, you know, really just seamlessly and meaningful.
I have the next question building on this very productive discussion. Again, talking about 2030, what advice would you give the field, device manufacturers, researchers, patient advocates, regulators on incorporating PGHD in the next 5 years or 6 years, if we're counting to 2030, depending on how you count? We're in the middle of 2024 already. I will start with Jeremy.
Sure. Thanks, Elena. It's a great question, and I think it's where we sit today is how do we get there, and what advice should we be listening to? I think where we have seen things move forward, and you know, to Andy's point, we want to get to a place where this is no longer a talk about this is digital versus traditional. You know, if you look back at what happened with ECOA, we don't talk about writing things on paper anymore. It's just how we do it. And I think to get there, it's going to take critical mass. You know, I think we need to get to a place where we're doing things pre-competitively, rather than trying to say who owns some new IP or new asset. We have to get some pre-competitive work. If I walk in the door at FDA, it helps if I'm talking to 5 or 6 sponsors at the same time about an initiative that gets us to a better way to measure a therapy for a patient. We're not trying to differentiate on the measure, we're trying to differentiate on the compound. And so, for me, I would say taking a collaborative approach, and that goes for device vendors, that goes for sponsors across the board to get there. And then, also just being innovative and being, taking things step by step, but also, embracing it as a part of what we do, rather than looking at it as, well, how do I get an ROI on this thing that this new thing? We're not in the stage where we're ready to see an instant return on our investment. We're in a stage where we're working together to get to a place that's better ultimately for the people who are going to benefit from our new approaches here. And so let's start talking about it in a way that doesn't rush right away to those factors around money. Let's keep the end in mind. And let's focus on what we need to do together in a collaborative fashion to move the needle in a way that we all know it needs to happen.
Thank you. Kristen, what do you see from your perspective?
Yeah, well, again, I'm maybe linking a little bit to what Jeremy just articulated around kind of linking to pre-competitive approaches, collaborative approaches. I think one of the messages I wanted to be sure to convey as part of this opening discussion was just the importance of collaborating and engaging with patients and patient communities, right, in all of this work, whether they're individual patients or patient organizations, communities of patients. again, patient-generated, patient-reported does not necessarily mean patient-engaged or what patients would prioritize. And I think that it's important to establish those relationships and those engagements for companies. And I think doing it in a pre-competitive and a collaborative way is really valuable and important. I think a lot of what's happening right now is individual entities or actors coming to patient communities asking them to partner on patient input about unmet needs or patient data about natural history or all sorts of other patient journeys, developing patient journeys, and they're all very bespoke. And patient communities are under a lot of stress. It's a good kind of stress, in that they're being asked for their input and to help develop registries and other sources of patient-generated health data. But we need to make sure that we're not creating additional burden for those individuals and communities to participate. We need them. They bring something really valuable and unique to the process. So to the extent that companies can be collaborative and pre-competitive, I think that's only good, and not compete on their bespoke approach to engaging patients. I think that would help move the field forward. And I think there is value to be had in improving the capacity of patients and patient organizations to participate in the process. It takes time, it takes resources, but it really is important. I did want to capture the equity considerations as well. I think we've talked about those a little bit already, and we've alluded to them. But I think again, we have to be intentional about this. Just because digital approaches make it easier does not mean that people will not be left out for a variety of reasons. I think people have to have access to technology tools. Sometimes the tools need to not be technology. Maybe people need a choice of how they participate and how they contribute their data in order for us to achieve a more diverse group of participants and to achieve equity. And the diversity in the data sets that we're using and the data sets that we're training AI on also are obviously critical. I think we're using, in many cases, legacy data sets that are not diverse. And so to the degree that we're training systems on that data, we're sort of baking in inequities for the future. So those are a couple of ideas that I wanted to kind of capture as well.
Annie, what do you think?
I definitely agree with everything that Jeremy and Kristen said. We need to be intentional upfront of how we're engaging with communities so we don't leave people behind, but it needs to also be a continuous engagement and really be cyclical and not just one-off linear, but we're really building those partnerships, and we're building those partnerships across different multidisciplinary expertise. So like in our good machine learning principles for AI/ML devices that we put out with Health Canada and MHRA, the first principle is about having a multidisciplinary team. And so that's really across the board. Like, you need patients, you need communities, you need tech developers, you need the measurement scientists, you need healthcare integration, you need, so that we can think about how do you integrate these tools in ways that are meaningful across the spectrum, not just in clinical trial design, but also ultimately, hopefully, integrated into people's day-to-day care. And that's where the partnership aspect is really so key. And the idea of pre-competitive collaborations is really important, so that we're not all doing our own things and wasting resources, wasting people's time, if we can do a lot of this work collectively together. And, I include that we at the FDA are, part of that partnership as well. And so whether it's from a regulatory perspective of coming in to talk to us early and often about, the plans. And then of course, we are part of different collaborative communities and pre-competitive spaces, so we can provide our input from like a regulatory science perspective as well. So I think these are all, in order for us to move the field forward, we all need to partner together so we can actually realize the vision that we've started to talk about.
Thank you all. We got a number of great questions in the Q&A, and we probably won't have time to go through all of them, but I see some of the recurrent themes in Q&A, and I want to make sure we spend some time. Some of the questions are related about data standardization, best practices, and knowledge and skills to maneuver the PGHD data. Some of the questions are directed to me as a patient, but I think it would be more valuable if we can hear from our panelists of what we need to achieve to standardize PGHD data collection that will improve its usability, interpretability, and at the end of the day, being leveraged for both medical tool development and care delivery. Who would like to go first?
I can start. I think standards is definitely a key aspect of that, both from a data standards interoperability aspect, but then also from a measurement of, are you measuring the thing that you think you're measuring? And so if we can create some standards that we expect, say for accelerometry, for gait measurement, that you have, if you meet this performance standard, regardless of what technology you are, then we have some confidence as a field that you're measuring what we think you're measuring. And so I think, consensus standards and other activities are going to be key aspects for how we move things forward. And then, of course, working collaboratively, and this includes like colleagues across the federal government and other sectors too, in terms of interoperability, like with our colleagues at ONC, we talk quite a bit about sort of the integration of especially consumer data with EHR data. How do we develop those data flows? And then we also need to think about, Kristen brought up AI algorithms and, making sure you've got the right data sets that are diverse. And so ensuring that we're creating diverse data sets that are equitable, that we can train our models on, and we understand ultimately what the data actually means, because there is a lot of data that can come from these DHTs. So it's important to actually be able to determine what's actionable from it versus just, a whole laundry list of data. And, Elena, you did that yourself, but how we actually can move that everyone can be able to do that.
I think it's a great advice. Jeremy.
Yeah, I mean, we're on a DIME webinar, so I would be ashamed if I didn't point out the momentum and progress that we've actually made here around calling out how we standardize some of the work that we do around this process. I mean, the B3 framework gives us clarity around how to get analytical and clinical validation. And so some of that work is kind of happening already. And in some cases, for measurements that we're familiar with around physiological measures, a lot of that has a clear standard. We know what blood pressure is. Right? We know how to do that. We know how to take that measurement. We're just going to do it digitally. Same thing with temperature. It's the areas that are kind of new that we don't really understand. How do we take an accelerometer and measure behavior? Right? Those are the gaps that we need to work on together. But there is a standard for that accelerometer data. We understand what that is, and that's out there. I think as we start to see some primary endpoints come into play here for these clinical trials, the natural next place that we'll see things happen will be approval of drugs with these measures. And then we move into the care side. We move into the post-market. That's where we start to see the implementation of some of these standards that are going to happen. But I think, we're kind of that middle stage right now, trying to get to the place where we understand how to get approvals in a clinical trial phase and then kind of move it into mainstream. So that's just my perspective from what we're doing today.
Kristen?
I don't know if I have a lot to add to what Annie and Jeremy said. Certainly, by far the least expert on data standards and interoperability and such, but not to be a broken record on the patient engagement theme. But I think there's certainly, as we're kind of advancing the validation of digital tools and endpoints, I think just working with patient communities and patients to try to prioritize maybe where we're putting our efforts. I think we're accustomed to measuring things in this world, this universe of ours that are easy to measure and have been easy to measure, and we have a lot more tools in the toolkit in the now. So I think sometimes we lose focus maybe on what we should be prioritizing in terms of standardizing and validating, and I think that's another area where kind of bringing in that patient voice and patient input at the front end, and understanding what the unmet needs and what's meaningful and what outcome measures we really ought to be prioritizing can be really helpful. And I'll say it's wonderful to see there are a lot of platforms now where there are people thinking in rigorous ways about how to integrate patient-centered, if I can use that term, measures and endpoints, et cetera, into into our processes. So it's happening, which is wonderful to see.
And we have a few minutes left. There is another theme across the questions in the Q&A that pertains to a specific devices. People ask questions about platform integrating the data from OTC technologies, and I'm assuming it's both wellness products and medical devices. There is a question if PGHD applies to all medical devices and IVD devices, which I don't know if it brings us outside of the FDA definition of DHT. And there is also a question about which technologies to use. I think we have a great panel here with the device manufacturer, with a patient group, and the FDA on where we stand, which technologies can be used for PGHD data, what is practical, what are the expectations from the regulators, and frankly, what would make sense to do to advance the field again to empower the patients.
Well, maybe I'll take one piece of sort of clarifying a couple of the questions that you highlighted. So not all digital health technologies are medical devices, but patient-generated health data could certainly apply across the board, whether it's an in vitro diagnostic or a more traditional device or a digital health technologies. And since this is a MDUFA medical device related meeting, I think one thing that's important to highlight is this opportunity for this industry to both develop the technologies, but also use digital health technology as other devices as patient-generated data to support, say, a device trial. And so ideally, what we'd love to see is more PGHD in decision summaries, more MDDTs that we qualify, and that we are really seeing this as in our day-to-day activities.
Thank you, Annie. Jeremy, would you like to provide your perspective here?
Yeah, I mean, I think I've just got a minute left here, but I want to point out that at least from the work that we do at Actigraph, we're in the clinical trial side. This is the development time. This is where we are developing these novel endpoints, and we're creating new ways to measure it. That's what we're doing. This is the learning process that we're learning together. I want to really point out here, I know there's a lot of participants here that don't do this day in and day out, but folks like myself and Annie and Kristen, we work together constantly. And you see guidance coming out from FDA around, hey, how do we do this the right way in clinical trials? I'm telling you that everybody at our company can just about recite this thing by memory. Why? Because what that is a consensus view of how we do this the right way, how we begin to standardize and really look at where things can go wrong, right? So it's a risk-based approach. How do we eliminate the risk of getting this wrong? Like, we start with that. And out of that, you start to develop trends, and you start to see standards, and we're doing that now. And because of the work that the FDA has done, because of the work that DIME has done and others, we're beginning to see consensus happen around how data is collected, at what level and volume is it collected, and how do we validate it? How do we know that we're measuring something that's meaningful to the patient? I'm happy to see last year the first primary endpoint in a pivotal phase 3 using a standard measurement for actigraphy in pulmonary lung disease. Incredible to see that happen. And so that's from the work that we're doing here to work together closely in this tight-knit community of drug development and digital devices and patient data to pull those things together. So I'm grateful for it. Thank you.
And Christine, would you like to add anything here?
Just quickly, but I would love for you to have the last word on this topic. I mean, I think we've talked a lot about being patient-centric and meeting people where they are. People were asking about bring your own device. I think we have to always be thinking in this conversation about how to ensure that people have the opportunity to participate and to make it as easy as possible for them to participate. We need to do things in a high quality way. We have the ability to do that. We have the tools to do that. But we need to not, I think, overcomplicate things, which we also tend to do in this in this enterprise of ours. So I think just constantly sort of having the patients engaged, making that real, meeting people where they are. What does that actually mean? Understanding that and trying to be intentional about acting on it. But I think I'll leave it there and let you have the last word.
Yes, I would like to conclude saying I provided the example of technology is marketed directly to consumer, both wellness devices and medical devices. I'm super happy as a patient that FDA is very flexible about use of particular technology as long as they are proven to be fit for purpose and adequate to collect the data that it's intended, because it opens multiple opportunities for both researchers and patients. And what I hope to see when we approach 2030, that PGHD data is listed in patient charts along with their imaging results, with blood pressure test, and tests that we used to see routinely in the clinic for decades. They're just routine. They're part of clinical trials, they're part of healthcare, and patients are empowered to collect this data and discuss it with their doctors. To make it happen, we need to all work together to educate patients, to educate doctors, and very, very importantly, create empirical evidence that will provide a common denominator for all of us, making us comfortable generating and using this data. I would like to conclude with this word, the discussion panel, and thank the participants for participating, and I will pass the baton to Robert. Thank you all.